All right, well, let's get started this afternoon. Welcome everybody to this webinar at the American German Institute, formerly known as the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. I'm Dr. Eric Langenbacher, and I am the director of the Society, Culture, and Politics program here at AGI. And I'm really pleased to host Dr. Andrew Port from Wayne State University, who's going to be talking about his hot off the press new book called Never Again: Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. Dr. Port is also the author of Conflict and Stability in the German Democratic Republic. He's received the DAD Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in German and European Studies. In addition to being a professor of history at Wayne State University, he is the former editor-in-chief of the very prestigious journal Central European History. He's got a variety of awards, including the Board of Governors Distinguished Faculty Fellowship, as well as support from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the Whitting Foundation, and the Krupp Foundation. His research focuses on modern Germany, communism and state socialism, memory and comparative genocide, labor history, and social protest. He has lectured around the world, and we're just very pleased that he'll talk about his new book, which I think literally just days ago has come out with Harvard University Press. So Dr. Port has a short presentation that he will share with all of us, and then we will open it up to a moderated question and answer session. I would ask that everybody types their questions into the Q&A portal, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then I'll curate and read the questions off. But Dr. Port, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, and Jack as well for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Can you, okay, I'm sharing my screen, but the slideshow, how does that look? Do you actually see the slideshow now?
Yeah, it looks great.
Perfect. Okay, then I will get started. I will speak for about a half an hour, doing a reading from the book, talking a bit about the questions that I've been most interested in, and then I'm glad to take any questions that the people who are attending have. So let me get started. Set the scene. Sarajevo, several months after the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords that ended the war in Bosnia. Departing Serb forces in a final act of vengeful spite are setting aflame any structure still standing after their 4-year-long siege of the Bosnian capital. Dr. Rupert Neudeck spends the day with his son Marcel in a residential section of the city, breaking down doors and rushing into burning buildings to save the lives of elderly Muslims. The winter of 1996 is a cold one, and Dr. Neudeck is taking yet another holiday with his immediate family in an active war zone. This is the third time, it's his third time there since news first broke about genocidal ethnic cleansing, mass rapes, and the setting up of concentration camps in the Balkans. That evening, the renowned German journalist and humanitarian sits quietly in a Bosnian friend's apartment, reading, out of necessity by candlelight, a book about the Wehrmacht's occupation of Poland a half-century earlier. Waking to the sound of explosions early the next day, he looks out the window at all the destruction in the street below. Quote, "That was precisely how I imagined early mornings in the Warsaw Ghetto." There are olfactory reminders of the past as well. The road that, quote, smelled of genocide near Srebrenica, for instance, or the, quote, treacly foul stench of decaying corpses in Kigali. Yes, Rupert Neudeck had also been in Rwanda during the genocidal rampage of 1994, and that was no coincidence. Over the previous decade and a half, he had frequently been among the first German volunteers to arrive in trouble spots across the globe, organizing dozens of humanitarian missions from Southeast Asia to Southeast Europe. Most of this work was done on the side as a shoestring operation of sorts. During vacation or nights and weekends with his wife Christel in their modest townhouse on the outskirts of Cologne. And that was where I visited Neudeck to find out why he had chosen to go to places like Mogadishu instead of Mallorca, which is a preferred vacation spot for most middle-class Germans. Now, Neudeck, as you can see in the photo here, he cut a dashing figure with a gaunt, weathered face and neatly trimmed white beard. He had the air of a sea captain, though he was often mistaken for a medical doctor, an understandable error given all the medical assistance he had brought to Asia and Africa over the years. He was, in fact, a doctor of philosophy. Born in Danzig on the eve of World War II, Neudeck fled westward with his mother and younger siblings away from the Red Army in the waning months of the war. He studied law as a young man and served as a Jesuit novice, but then he decided to change course and write a doctoral thesis on the political ethics of Sartre and Camus. After completing his degree, Neudeck took a different career path once again, beginning work in 1977 as a journalist and editor at West Germany's premier public radio station. He and his wife, he later told me, were leading a perfectly, as a quote, perfectly bourgeois life at the time. That all changed in February 1979 during a trip he took to Paris to collect material for a new book on Sartre. It was there that Neudeck met with the renowned French philosopher André Glucksmann, the first to speak with him at length about the dire situation of the so-called boat people in Southeast Asia. Their plight had just broken as a major news story several months earlier. Neudeck tells the story. He walks into the cafe. Glucksmann jumps up and says, "Que faites-vous?" That's how he greeted him. What was he going to do personally about the refugees? Neudeck had similarly memorable meetings with Sartre himself and with Bernhard Kouchner, the future foreign minister, founded Doctors Without Borders in 1971. In the slide on the left here, you see Kouchner at the time. He had organized a boat called Un Bateau pour le Vietnam, a boat for Vietnam, where he went to rescue boat people fleeing Indochina, former Indochina after the war. Inspired by the three men, Neudeck returned to Germany, intent on doing his part to help refugees from the region who were stranded and dying on the high seas, a decision that had a great deal to do with Neudeck's own personal history. On January 30th, 1945, during their flight from Danzig, he and his family arrived in the Baltic port city of Gotenhafen, where they saw a large cruise ship in the harbor, the Wilhelm Gustloff. Originally built in the mid-1930s for the Nazi leisure movement, Strength Through Joy, Kraft durch Freude, the ship was now being used to evacuate German officials, civilians, and refugees from the advancing Soviet army. Neudeck's mother didn't have tickets for the Gustloff. She wouldn't have taken a, quote, luxury ship for Nazi bigwigs anyway, he later insisted, and they wound up on board a coal steamer instead. That was our savior, he later told me. Later that day, the Soviet submarine sank the Gustloff and thousands of its passengers drowned in the freezing waters of the Baltic. The news quickly reached him and his family, and horrific images of the disaster left an indelible impression on the 5-year-old. And this was why Neudeck believed death by drowning became such an important archetype in his life and a major motivation for his later relief efforts. Thanks to a flood of donations, Neudeck was able to charter and outfit a decommissioned Dutch freighter, the Cap Anamour. By the summer of 1982, the ship had rescued almost 10,000 boat people, most of whom were later allowed to seek refuge in the Federal Republic. The group became best known at the time for this perilous undertaking, but its activities were not limited to saving the lives of those fleeing by sea. Neudeck also sent teams of German doctors and nurses to the Thai-Cambodian border to assist Cambodian refugees who had just survived the Khmer Rouge genocide. On the slide on the left, you see Neudeck hoisting a sign at this refugee camp, and at the slide on the right, you see him with some young children who were saved on the Cap Anamour. The work of his group in the refugee camps relied on the generous support of private citizens and German celebrities, including the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Heinrich Böll. Equally essential was the engagement of hundreds of West Germans who volunteered for stints of 4 to 8 weeks. And that included one nurse from Bonn who decided to volunteer instead of taking a ski vacation that year, and who, she later explained, worked for 5 weeks, quote, under the most primitive conditions, her words. To be effective, Neudeck believed, volunteers had to live together with the people without any showers or other niceties. Quote, experiencing hardship and physically sharing their everyday reality is crucial for aid work. One detects here the Christian impulse behind this former Jesuit novice's activities and perhaps a scholarly interest in existential philosophy as well. A childhood trauma, a Catholic upbringing, and a fortuitous visit to Paris in the winter of 1979. These were the three main influences that first spurred Rupert Neudeck into action. And when I sat with him decades later in a living room filled to the brim with foreign art and other artifacts he had collected from abroad over the years, the conversation eventually turned to why his volunteers did what they did. They had endless motivations, he surmised, but there was almost certainly a very great collective willingness on the part of his fellow Germans to do, quote, more for humanitarian issues than all other European nationalities. And that most certainly has to do with the past, end quote. But which past exactly? His own motivation, he readily acknowledged, had been his traumatic experiences as a child refugee. What about the suffering the Germans had caused and not the suffering that they had earlier experienced themselves? What role did that play? Nazi crimes against humanity, and against the Jews in particular, had played a, quote, powerful role, he believed, adding that his organization's activities were a, quote, semi-conscious attempt to compensate somehow for this past, to portray Germany, quote, a little bit differently in the world. And when it came to humanitarian action, German volunteers always did more than other Europeans, he insisted, because they didn't want to be surpassed in their efforts. This was, after all, one area where they were, quote, allowed to be on top of the world. Several weeks after meeting with Rupert Neudeck, I spoke with Helmut Schmidt about his government's response to the Cambodian genocide. The former West German chancellor had come under attack in the late 1970s for not doing enough to help the refugees in Indochina. What happened tens of thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia did not threaten Germany in any way, he bluntly told me, and the genocide in Cambodia didn't concern us. Quote, almost all Asian countries committed acts that violated morality, Huffley added, but this was simply not, quote, our affair. It's nice the way he said it in German. Es war nicht unser Bier, wasn't our affair. The Federal Republic's vital interests came before moral and humanitarian considerations, he told me. In the realm of foreign affairs, those interests consisted almost exclusively of the existential threat posed by Soviet nuclear weapons stationed in Eastern Europe. Foreign Minister Genscher, whom you see here on the right, and during the interview, Genscher referred to him as, he said that Genscher was my foreign minister. He said that his foreign minister, well, he didn't tell me this, but this is something I had found in the archives. Genscher had a similar take at the time. He was annoyed by repeated requests for information about the Cambodian genocide and wanted to know why some West German politicians like Hans-Joachim Vogel of the SPD were placing, quote, so much value on this issue anyway. Well, whatever reservations the two men may have had, their country would take in almost 14,000 refugees from Indochina by the spring of 1980. And you see here some arriving at the airport, I believe, in Frankfurt. That was the highest number among Western nations without any special ties to the regions, such as the United States or France. By way of explanation, West German officials pointed to their own country's bitter experiences involving mass flight and expulsion in the 1940s and 1950s. Genscher himself had fled East Germany as a young man. But as the number of refugees skyrocketed worldwide beginning in the late 1970s, and with it, the number of people applying for asylum in the Federal Republic, the initial willingness to welcome those poor souls from war-torn, who were fleeing war-torn regions quickly gave rise to angry resentment about foreign fraud supposedly taking advantage of German generosity. Two contrasting sets of responses then to one of the world's most horrific genocides since the systematic murder of the European Jews in the 1940s. Copious concern and bountiful largesse, apparent indifference and acrimonious backlash, responses that prefigure in many ways developments in today's Federal Republic. Since 2015, the xenophobic far right has enjoyed a political resurgence there in the wake of Chancellor Angela Merkel's controversial decision that year to welcome more than 1 million refugees from Africa and the Middle East. Both developments drew global attention to Germany, but neither the Chancellor's largesse nor the backlash it brought in its wake should have been a surprise, at least not to those familiar with the story of what Germans have talked about and done in response to genocide and other mass suffering in foreign lands since 1945. There are few countries more haunted by the darker aspects of their recent history than Germany. 75 years after the end of World War II, the barbaric crimes committed by the Nazis continue to cast a long shadow at home and abroad, coloring perceptions and self-perceptions of the country and its people. Yet, the story of how Germans managed to put their violent genocidal past behind them in practice and create a stable and prosperous democracy reluctant to use force and committed to the defense of human rights, that's an equally important and gripping tale. If the driving question about the years prior to 1945 had long been a disheartening one, where did Germany go wrong? The period since the war presents a different puzzle. How and why did Germany go right? My new book, Never Again, tackles these questions in a roundabout way, using German responses to mass murder in other lands to understand how the weight of the past shaped beliefs and influenced actual behavior in the post-war present. I consciously chose this indirect approach, German reactions to foreign genocide, because I hope to present a less stilted picture of German memory work. What do I mean by that? Well, there are many abstract theories about the nature and significance of collective memory. But to my mind, its true importance lies in its consequences, in its tangible effects on actual attitudes and actions. And that's why I focus in my book less on solemn statements by high-level officials, the usual approach to German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, and more on the concrete acts that came in response to reports of foreign genocide decades after the final solution. To get at these issues, I specifically look at German responses to the three infamous genocides that took place in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. That choice is important because it lays bare evolving reactions in a comparative way, evolving reactions to mass murder during a period of drastic change, from the height of the Cold War, when two German states still existed, to the period following unification, from a time when few Germans showed much interest in the Holocaust to one when few topics generated as much public attention as the genocide of the European Jews. The precise timing of these genocides is also significant. By chance, a conspicuous spike in interest about the fate of the European Jews coincided with the genocide in Cambodia. In fact, the Khmer Rouge were driven from power the very month the American miniseries Holocaust aired on West German television in January 1979. That sensational media event, and here you see a cover from the Spiegel at the time, cover story about it. That sensational media event initiated a public fixation on the final solution at precisely the point in time when firsthand details about the carnage in Cambodia began to emerge. And it fundamentally influenced German responses to the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. In turn, it affected how Germans spoke and thought about their own past. And that became especially clear during the infamous Historikerstreit, or historians' quarrel of the mid-1980s, a fierce public debate about the uniqueness and causes of what now increasingly became known as the Holocaust. And I'm glad to talk more about that during the question and answer if anyone would like to. There are other good reasons for beginning in the 1970s. This was the decade when global interest in human rights reemerged. It was also when the worldwide flow of refugees reached unprecedented proportions, a development that had a major impact on German responses to foreign genocide. It stimulated humanitarian efforts to relieve mass suffering abroad, but it also stoked fears about letting in quote unquote too many foreigners, especially supposedly bogus ones, coming to Germany for purely venal reasons. Few issues, as I'm sure most of you know, have enlivened and politicized public debate of late as much as immigration. And of course, not just in the Federal Republic, as Americans are well aware. My book draws attention to two contradictory impulses then since the 1970s. Rampant fear, anger, and resentment about overburdening and, quote, excessive foreignization, Überfremdung, and a widespread desire, even compulsion for some because of Germany's past, to help the less fortunate. A look at German reactions to genocide during the first half of the 1990s takes our story into the period after the Cold War, and thus into a much different geopolitical context. Germany's unexpected unification in 1990 not only marked the end of 4 decades of division, but also transformed the country's international position. The restoration of full sovereignty meant that the country now had greater freedom for maneuver, as well as greater international responsibilities. And its responses to the twin genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda show how this dramatically reconfigured the country's foreign policy, as well as its relationship to its own past. The Federal Republic's changed standing in the world gave rise to a great deal of anguish and hand-wringing at the time. Would unified Germany remain a, quote, tamed power? Or would it revert to its dangerous and destructive ways of yore? Had the country truly learned the lessons of its history? The question of what those lessons even were became a great source of vexed debate in the shadow of genocidal atrocities in the Balkans, where unified Germany faced its most significant challenge abroad since unification: whether to participate in joint military efforts aimed at stopping genocide and other human rights abuses on foreign soil. That confronted Germans with difficult choices that threw into disarray the old post-war consensus on foreign policy and the non-use of force. Even renowned pacifists like Joschka Fischer, the former student radical and future foreign minister, first Green foreign minister, came down on the side of quote unquote humanitarian intervention. My initial interest in German responses to foreign genocide came in the summer of 1992, when I first heard reports that Serbs had set up quote unquote concentration camps in Bosnia. I was living in Germany at the time, doing research for my dissertation, and I vividly recall television images like the ones you see here of emaciated men with shaved heads standing behind barbed wire. The images resonated for obvious reasons, and I distinctly recall thinking that this could not be true, that there couldn't be concentration camps in Europe in 1992. I also recall a great deal of skepticism in Germany, as well as policymakers, public figures, and the media struggled to come up with a quote unquote proper response. Never again Auschwitz, or never again war. These two slogans encapsulated the harrowing dilemma that many Germans faced after learning about the genocidal atrocities taking place in Bosnia. Should their country, because of its past, stand by and do nothing in response to reports of yet another genocide, this time only a day's drive from Berlin? Or should they participate in international interventions intended to stop the mass slaughter by force? The story of how Germans confronted their past and the concrete consequences that had in response to mass atrocities abroad, it's a highly relevant story that is arguably as worthy of our interests as the darker topics in modern Germany history, right? The focus on Nazism and the Holocaust is understandable, of course. After all, who writes or reads novels about happy couples? But The attention my book devotes to the admirable and I think often uplifting actions of Germans from all walks of life offers other countries with difficult pasts, including the United States, a master class of sorts in coming to terms with the more sinister aspects of their own history, especially at a time when many seem to fear the United States might go the way Germany did in the 1930s. Now, looking to the Germans for inspiration reinforces a widespread tendency to see post-war Western Germany as a success story. Now, there are good reasons for questioning that simple but uplifting narrative, which downplays the less sanguine aspects of Germany's post-war history. Still, even with that caveat in mind, and even when not measured against the horrible foil of Nazi Germany, the Federal Republic was indeed a success story, a place where Germans effectively put their violent, once genocidal past behind them. And their responses to genocides in foreign lands are an important but untold part of that story. Now, it's true that those responses did not do much to prevent genocide. They were more reactive than active, even when it was taking place in their own backyard in the Balkans. And despite their obligations as an early signatory of the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. But my book doesn't take a normative or prescriptive approach. It's not a j'accuse about what Germans should have done in the face of genocide, right? Again, I should add, it's not like what Samantha Power does in her book, A Problem from Hell. It's really not a j'accuse. My book explores instead the parameters of the possible for post-war Germany, given the weight of its past and its own international position before and after 1989. Hardly anyone, least of all the Germans themselves, would have wished or expected East or West Germany to take military action abroad. That, of course, would change dramatically after unification, and that transformation, along with the stormy domestic debates unleashed by the decision to intervene militarily in Bosnia, are central themes of my book. It's an important point, this one that no one expected the Germans to take military action abroad, because I think it moves the conversation beyond moralistic condemnations of inaction, beyond the writing of history as quote unquote politics by other means. For most countries, grand actions involving military force are extremely difficult or simply not possible. And that's why I focus instead in my book on what German officials and citizens could and did do short of sending combat troops, providing various forms of humanitarian assistance, for example, welcoming large numbers of refugees to Germany, exerting diplomatic pressure behind the scenes, and forcing economic sanctions. Reports of mass atrocities goaded Germans into action, and what they did went far beyond high-sounding speeches meant to abjure or atone for past atrocities. And that's significant, I think, because it reveals a great deal about German values, mentalities, and lessons learned after 1945. Again, lessons that should be of interest, I think, to Americans searching for effective ways to reckon with the more sordid aspects of their own country's past. Some of you at this point who are familiar with Susan Neiman's book, Learning from the Germans, will hear echoes of that here, but as you'll see as I come closer to the end of this talk, that I go in a somewhat different direction. What has struck me repeatedly about German reactions to foreign genocide is that the legacy and lessons of the Third Reich and the Holocaust were not at all clear-cut. The difficult choice between never again Auschwitz or never again war captures just how ambivalent the burden of history could be. In fact, as my book shows again and again, Germany's violent past could be and was used to draw diametrically opposed conclusions about the proper response to reports of foreign genocide. Those who tended to see Germany's hands tied because of its history, who spoke passionately of a duty to nonviolence because of Nazi atrocities, met with equally heartfelt counterarguments by those who pointed to their country's past as an injunction to act. Quote, "We have a political and moral duty to assist precisely in light of our history," Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel told his colleagues in June 1995, just 2 weeks before the genocidal massacre in Srebrenica. Quote, "It was after all the Allies who, using military force, by the way, freed us from the Nazi dictatorship." Now, if the Third Reich has taught anything, it's perhaps that there are no easy answers to these debates. But my book draws attention to something just as important, I think. The mass suffering caused by Germans was not necessarily the past that mattered most. As Rupert Neudeck's story teaches us, the suffering that Germans experienced themselves, their profound sense of victimhood, could be equally motivational, and so could perceptions of political and economic self-interest. In fact, my book shows how these debates about proper responses to genocide were used over and over to score points against domestic political rivals, with progressives accusing conservatives of supporting humanitarian military intervention in hopes of one day storing Germany's status as a Großmacht, as a great power. Those on the right responded in kind, asking why the left had remained so silent about Cambodia when communists there butchered millions. What these debates also show is that most conservatives confronted and took responsibility for Germany's past as seriously as their opponents on the left. That's an important and often overlooked legacy of the progressive political upheavals of the late 1960s, when Nazi crimes became, for almost all Germans, regardless of political outlook, the measure of all things evil. The willingness of conservative Germans to countenance their country's difficult past and draw important lessons from it distinguishes it from many of their counterparts in the United States, who seem disinclined to confront, much less take responsibility for the history and legacy of, say, American racism. But it should also serve as a sign of encouragement that such efforts need not be politically exclusive or one-sided, nor should remorse. One final comment, and then I'll end my talk. There's another important lesson here for an American audience. And again, here's where I part ways a bit with Susan Nyman. What to avoid when confronting the past. After 2 decades of deafening silence about the Holocaust, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction beginning in the late 1960s, producing an almost obsessive public preoccupation with the dark side of Germany's past. That eventually produced an angry backlash, even on the part of those who can in no way be considered apologists for the Third Reich. I refer to Germans, even on the left, who complain that the political and moralistic use of negative memories about the Nazi past had been used as a high-handed moral cudgel against political enemies. My book shows how these very disputes dominated public discussion about genocide in foreign lands, fueling accusations that foreign atrocities were being used to relativize Germany's own earlier crimes. This played out in the very way that language was used. Heated debates about the appropriateness of referring to Serb prison compounds and Bosnia's concentration camps was just one example of this. We had a similar debate in the US about holding facilities for immigrants in our southern border. The point is, and I will end on this thought, the point is that Americans can indeed learn from the Germans about confronting their own checkered past. But those lessons are ambivalent. The need to achieve a balance between too little and too much, to strike a proper tone that does not give rise to nasty recriminations and indignant backlash. That, I think, is perhaps the most important lesson the Germans can offer us. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to stop the share. Hope I didn't go too long over.
No, that was wonderful, and a great overview of an incredibly rich book, which I can't wait to read. So I'll wait for our participants to put some questions into the chat, but of course I have a couple of comments and questions as well.
Sure.
First, I was especially appreciative of the point that you made regarding Rupert Neudeck and several others about how it's not always the memory that one might think is motivating them that actually motivated them. And the fact that he was an expellee from Danzig was obviously a very kind of important force. And I think that's a very, very good point to make, especially when one thinks about the memory battles between different memories, how all sorts of memories can have different implications, some more progressive, some less progressive. And I personally think, having done a little bit of research on what I've called the memory of German suffering, that it doesn't have to be a kind of right-wing memory, but there are progressive lessons that can be gleaned from that as well. And I think that sounds like just a really important kind of finding from your book. I also was going to ask, but then you subsequently addressed it, that it's interesting that this kind of shift in the late 70s, early 80s in German policy towards kind of helping those that were affected by genocides abroad, that also coincided with a shift in US foreign policy under the Carter administration, which we look back as this kind of inflection point where we moved away from pure realpolitik and started to add these humanitarian concerns as well. So maybe that's my kind of first question. I guess from a more global or at least Western context, what was it that led to this kind of transnational shift in at least partial emphasis of foreign policy during that time period?
Well, you know, I'm sure many of you here are familiar with Samuel Moyn's book, The Last Utopia, where he argues that the issue of human rights really becomes, it really starts to attract attention in the 1970s. And he, of course, points to things like Carter's speeches that Jimmy Carter held on these issues. I think, you know, several things are coming together, right? You have starting, you know, the late 60s, people like Kushner and others getting, and West Germans as well, getting involved in Biafra. There's a greater willingness, I imagine, that's made also in part possible by changes in ability to travel, right? High-speed jets and all that. People can go around the world and actually start to, you know, go abroad and do these kinds of things. Although, as we know, this already begins earlier in the 50s. The East and West Germans are sending people out on humanitarian missions. But I think a whole complex of things come together in the 1970s that allow for this kind of interest, again, especially in the wake of '68 and greater talk about the Nazi past, that Germans seem to feel a greater sense of responsibility for doing something.
All right, we have some questions that are now coming in. And this goes to, I think, your last points when you were talking about any potential lessons for the United States from what's been happening or what has happened in Germany. And in particular, did you look at how Germans teach these topics, German responses to genocides in schools? And are there any, I guess, pedagogical or curricular lessons that might influence such debates in the United States?
Yeah, no, I don't know whether this topic is taught in German schools. You know, maybe with the publication of the book, if it appears in German, maybe it will be. We can only hope. So I really, I really can't answer that. As far as lessons for American schools, again, I would just repeat what I said in my talk, which is this need, I think, to get away from finger pointing and moralism and mutual recriminations, and the need to just have, you know, sane, sober discussions about what had happened in the past and how we today can confront these kinds of issues. I don't want to take this. I would like, I see that there's a question about Germany and support for the Palestinian people. That was the first question, and I'm happy to respond to that, even though you may not want me to. Is that okay if I say a word to that?
Of course, please.
Yeah, it's not the first time. So for those of you who can't see, Dan has written, "You say never again, but Germany supports Israel and its genocide of the Palestinian people. How do you reconcile that hypocrisy?" I would say this. I used to react, as the Germans say, very allergically to this claim that the Israelis were committing genocide in Israel. The more I did research and the more I learned about the UN Genocide Convention, I certainly can see why some people would make the case. And I'm not going to comment on that, whether or not I do think it's genocide. But it's certainly a legitimate question. Is it hypocrisy? Well, I think, well, I mean, again, this is not, it's not something that I focused on Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda. And I think it would be very interesting for someone to examine how Germans talk about, obviously work has been done on this, and Dirk Moses with this German catechism that he published, which led to a major debate, has brought this topic out into the open. I think there's a lot to be said there. Is it hypocrisy? Well, Germans are in a very difficult position there, and you can imagine what it would be like for Germans to accuse Israelis of genocide. And I think one has to have an understanding for the past and for the difficult situation they face themselves.
Well, actually, before we have 3 questions about the Eastern German angle. Before we do that, along these lines, I did kind of want to ask a little something. So I think that your case selection is superb. Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda. Those are also the best known, I think, genocides in Germany and elsewhere. But what about other, trickier situations that might be difficult to classify as genocide, but there still was quite a bit of killing or mass death that the Germans didn't respond to? So I guess the kind of question is, what does it take for Germans to, want to reactively respond to some horrible events and not to others?
I think the simple answer to that is the role that the media plays, and not just in Germany. The 3 that I focused on, in a sense, those are the 3 genocides since 1945 that have, received the most attention: media attention, popular attention, scholarly attention. I chose those because, the source base was richest. I think I write in the conclusion, there have been claims of some 40 genocides since World War II. And one thinks of Bangladesh, Biafra, perhaps Darfur. I just found out yesterday that a very interesting book appeared on how not just German responses, but international responses to the genocide in Darfur. Yes, there are others I could have looked at. I think equally interesting would be looking at German responses to apartheid in South Africa. But one has to make choices, and I decided on these 3 case studies. But in response to your question, I really do believe that the media plays a determinative role here, also for the interest not just of the German quote unquote masses, but also for politicians. It's quite clear if you read Bundestag debates. I write a bit about Petra Kelly in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Her response to what was going on in Cambodia, the chance that the Khmer Rouge might come to power. She collected folders and folders of German newspapers, but also foreign newspapers, copiously taking notes. It's quite clear that played a major role.
All right, so let's turn back to the Q&A, and I'll try to bundle 3 questions here. The first one asked you to talk a bit about your comparison of West German and East German responses to the genocide in Cambodia. The second question also asked, did the GDR regime, which had ties to Vietnam, do anything for Cambodia? Did it use West German indecision or inactivity as a propaganda tool in its campaign against the FRG? And then the third is this an entirely West German story, or were there similar discursive mechanisms at work in the GDR before 1990?
These are all really good questions, and they're all questions I deal with in depth within the book. Another reason why I chose to work on Cambodia was because both German states still existed at the time. The responses were indeed quite different, despite what I've been told by some Germans who say, West Germans, former West Germans, who said nobody knew anything about the Cambodian genocide at the time. It's simply not true. It was there was a lot of reporting about it in the media. People had a very good sense of what was going on there. The West German government certainly had a very good sense. The East Germans did as well. The East Germans had a very good sense of the atrocities taking place there as well. They, but this was not reported on in the media for obvious, for obvious reasons. It wouldn't have made for a great headline. Khmer Rouge, the communist Khmer Rouge is butchering people in Cambodia. Obviously, in West Germany, that made for a great headline in certain, in certain circles, in certain media circles. The East Germans, the East German interest, or at least it starts to be discussed in public when Vietnam and Cambodia go to war in the winter of 1978-79, when Vietnam invades. This has to do with the geopolitical constellation there, who the Soviets support, who the Chinese support, but all of a sudden, it does become a topic in East Germany. Interestingly enough, there is some incredibly strong reporting done by East German journalists like Geo Lehat and others about who traveled to Cambodia and saw what had saw the traces of what had taken place there. And I was really, Neues Deutschland is not exactly a newspaper I ever thought cutting edge stories, but when it came to Cambodia, it certainly did. As far as aid goes, there the Cold War once again played a very important role. The East Germans, I met with the ambassador, the first East German ambassador to Cambodia, a fellow named Rolf Dach, who went there in January '79, so shortly after the Khmer Rouge were ousted from power. He was instrumental in getting goods and various forms of humanitarian support for the Cambodians. The West Germans, by contrast, again, for Cold War reasons, did not directly give aid to Cambodia. Instead, they helped those Cambodians who were stuck in refugee camps on the Thai border, so in Thailand itself. But as I say, there's a lot more I could say about the differences between the East and West German reactions. I have a section in the book where I talk about this series of documentary films that were made by two famous East German documentary filmmakers, Walter Heinowski and Gerhard Scheumann. Really, really interesting material there. Also, especially in terms of the way they talked about the genocide there, the similarities in language, the allusions to fascism, to the Nazi past are really palpable. Another example, we tend to focus on the differences between East and West Germany, but this was a case where, at least the way they wrote about this genocide, where there was a lot of similarity.
All right, I'd like to return to your really interesting point, I guess, when you interviewed Helmut Schmidt, which is pretty darn cool, I must say, right? And the fact that he said Cambodia is not our affair, that national interest is more important than morality. I mean, I guess that's kind of what one would expect from, a legendary kind of realist politician like Schmidt in the 1970s. But I'm just wondering that in the more recent cases, in the 1990s, Bosnia and Rwanda, were there similar kind of realpolitik arguments that were made in the German political discourse?
I mean, it depended on the case. Rwanda was certainly not as important an issue in Germany. The genocide there was much more short-lived, essentially April to July 1994. The essential argument by the government was we don't have any interests there, geopolitical, whatever. There are other major powers, France, Belgium, that do because of their history. Although, of course, Germany had a history with Rwanda as well. It was part of Germany's largest colony, right? Southeast Africa? No, am I getting the name wrong? The East Africa. Sorry, I'm getting the precise name wrong, but there was little awareness of that at the time. I mean, as I write in the book, I think if and obviously we hope it doesn't, but if Rwanda would take place today, there seems to be so much more knowledge now, awareness of Germany's colonial past, right? Thanks to people like Jürgen Zimmermann and others who have written about this, that I think the response would be quite different today. Realpolitik. Well, I certainly think for some politicians that played a role. I don't think that the Germans responded to those two genocides in a way that realist political scientists would argue they should have, right, in terms of their interests and power. But as I write in the book, I think that, you know, how one defines one's interest depends on the country. And for Germany, its history played just as important a role, I believe, as any kind of simple understanding of what German interests were.
I think that's an excellent point, that national interest is also often constructed and is contested in many cases. So actually defining that is also kind of part of the political process. You know, which leads me, and I see that we are rapidly running out of time, but which leads me to my next and perhaps final point and question. So one of the things that you also emphasized, which I think is, you know, right on, is how the lessons from the past, well, I mean, first of all, you have the question, which past, right? And then you also noted that the lessons from whatever past is hegemonic are also not clear cut. They're also kind of constantly contested. And I think it's really interesting to kind of, you know, bring things up to the present. I'm personally very interested in how German memory culture has responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I still remember, like it was just yesterday, this interview that a former SPD leader gave in Eastern Germany about how, you know, you Americans just don't understand us Germans and our horrible fraught history with Russia. You know, Catherine the Great was a German princess, you know, this kind of thing, right? But it made me think in the context of your book that, you know, I think that sometimes we like to think that there's almost like a teleological evolution of these things, right? That back in the day, the lesson was never again war. But then because of, you know, what happened, I guess, first in Cambodia, but then especially vis-a-vis Bosnia in the 1990s, that shifted to never again Auschwitz, as one of your slides kind of said. But it seems to me that that newer lesson associated with Joschka Fischer and others has also kind of gone away, and we're back to never again war, at least in the context of kind of Russia. So I don't know, I think it's really interesting that it's not just that the lessons aren't clear cut, but they're ever changing. And sometimes one lesson will become dominant, but it doesn't stay dominant. And then another lesson will come to the fore. So it's this kind of ever changing flux.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe I'm extrapolating a little bit too much from your talk, but I found that to be really, really fascinating.
No, I think it's a good point. I think the issues that are being debated today about Ukraine, the issues being debated in Germany, are in many ways a throwback to the debates of the 1990s about the Balkans. Where I do notice a major shift is that when it comes to Ukraine, right? Should the Germans send weapons, et cetera? The shift that I see, and I write about this in an epilogue that my editor asked me to write for the end of the book, where I just addressed the responses to Ukraine. I did research for that. And what I found very interesting is that when the Germans now talk about the weight of the past and the Third Reich, they don't apply it necessarily to their own actions, what they should do in Ukraine, but rather they point to Moscow and suggest that Putin is acting like a Nazi, like a fascist. And I find that to be a very interesting development, right? If you read, for example, you know, the Emma letter that was signed by so many people and Habermas's intervention, there's not that, as there had been in the 90s, this focus so much on Germany's past and how that should affect or influence what Germany does there today. That said, I can't think of any country where the debate is so fraught about sending weapons to Ukraine than it is in Germany. Leaving aside Marjorie Taylor, I'm forgetting her, Smith? No, anyway, leaving aside that, the Germans still, there's a debate there, as far as I can tell, unlike debates in other countries when it comes to sending these weapons, and that certainly has to do with Germany's past.
That's also a great point. I think that in my reading, those voices that are reluctant to give more help to Ukraine are doing so not for kind of moral or ethical reasons, but rather because they fear that we won't have the resources if we need to defend Taiwan from Chinese aggression or whatever other kind of a purpose that we would need that war material for.
Yeah.
I can't resist one final comment, and that is that, well, it wouldn't be a major political debate in Germany if Habermas didn't intervene, right? Because he's intervened in many of the cases that you've talked about and other kind of existential events for Germany. So I see that we're basically out of time. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
No. I think I pretty much said what I mean, since you bring up Habermas, he was attacked. Tim Snyder wrote a very dismissive piece about him. What I like so much about Habermas's response, whether or not one agrees with him or not, it was very heartfelt. His focus is more on this fear of a third world war. He focuses on the generational issue, how his generation dealt with that constant fear. And one has to honor that. One may not agree with it. One again, Tim Snyder is someone who doesn't. But I'm struck again in these debates at how at what a high political but also kind of moral level they are conducted. And what I mean by that is that on both sides, people arguing this or people arguing that, they both seem to have really compelling arguments. And these are clearly people who have thought long and hard about these issues. Again, you can disagree with what they had to say, whether weapons should be sent or not, how involved Germany should get. But I really think we need to really honor the level of discourse there. Obviously with some exceptions in Germany, which I won't go into. But when I compare that to how we talk about issues here on some of our cable news networks, I think it's I think the Germans, they really do have a lot to teach us.
All right, wonderful. Well, on that note, we will conclude this webinar. I don't know about anybody else who is listening, but I am keen to get my hands on a copy and to read in even more detail about this very important topic. So thank you, Dr. Andrew Port, for taking the time to speak with us today about your exciting new book.
Thank you so much, Eric. I really enjoyed being here.
All right, bye, everybody.